So good evening. We opened the first session of this series of panel discussions, Bridge Forum 2, we call it. It is organized by our association called The Bridge, an Albanian-based NGO, and in cooperation with ISEC, a Students International Association. And we thank them for their partnership and their support. It is also financially supported by the agency, the Albanian Agency for the support of civil society. This is a continuation of panel discussions we had this spring, and the topics were sensitive topics of our region, especially related to youth. Now we will have, in this continuation, Bridge Forum 2, we'll have 3 sessions. First one is today. Then by beginning of December, we are planning a session in Tirana. It will be on site, but it will be disseminated by YouTube and social media. And then a third one by mid-January or second half of January. And we will also have a newsletter in which the presentations of the panelists will be published. It will be in English, the publication as well. Now, in the session of today, the topic is civil society. Civil society in a context in which the citizens have a rather negative idea of the state, the government as a parasite, or ideally as some entity that would embody and incarnate and defend the ethnicity, the nation, and so on and so forth. Therefore, there is a huge gap between the citizens, the individuals on the one hand, and the government on the other. Now, the place of the civil society in this structure, normally in a society, it is an independent space, an independent public sphere between the individual citizens and the government. It is crucial for the health of and the stability of democracy. We will discuss on this topic today. The panelists are Andrej Nikolaidis and Agon Maliqi. Andrej Nikolaidis is a writer and public intellectual from Montenegro. His commitment, his participation in the public debate, his criticism, because of all this, he has been threatened and even threatened to death. On the other hand, Agon Maliqi is a political analyst and also very active in the public debate. These are what these two personalities have in common is their commitment to human rights and democracy. Agon Maliqi, you know him from the previous session that we had on youth and brain drain in the Western Balkans. Now, I will give the floor first to Andrej, then to Agon Maliqi, and then we'll have a discussion. So please, Andrej, take the floor.
Okay, do you see me? Because I don't see myself.
I don't see you.
Just a second. You cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. That's what I got on the monitor.
I hear you. I can hear you, but I don't see you.
Yeah, but
or then if you want, I can give the floor first.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Yeah, okay, I think we're good now, are we?
Yes, now we can see.
Okay.
No, okay.
Okay, first of all, please excuse me for my at least broken English. There was a time when I used to speak it fluently, or should I say, more or less fluently. But as it comes with the age, because I'm getting into an old age, I just get into some kind of auto-isolation, and I don't speak rarely. I really rarely speak my own language, which is like Montenegrin / Serbian / Croatian / Bosnian, because it's the same language with 4 names. So I guess I forgot English, but I'll do my best, and let's hope you will understand me. Let me introduce myself. I was very active in NGO sector, let's say during 90s. And after that, I was not. Basically, I work now as a columnist, as a journalist, but not an investigational journalist, but a columnist, which means that I write opinions. I used to write for Vijesti from Podgorica, Mladina from Ljubljana. I published few articles in Editore. I was writing for The Guardian in London, for Al Jazeera Balkans in Sarajevo, Slobodna Bosna in Sarajevo, etc., etc. So I was in this I'm in this journalist business for a long time, at least 2 decades. But let me get back to my NGO years. My father founded NGO Plima / Batica, because Plima means tide, and I believe it's in Albanian it's Batica. Okay, so that was one of the first NGOs that were registered in Montenegro. I believe he founded it and registered it in first half of the 90s, and we started to publish a monthly called Plima / Batica. That was bilingual. We published it in Montenegrin and Albanian language too. For those of you who can't really remember that time or don't know much about that time, let me give you some context, because I think it's really important. That was a time when very militant Serbian nationalism was dominating political and every other segment of life in Montenegro, also obviously in Serbia. Those were the times where when Serbian nationalism wages wars in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Croatia. Later, Kosovo will become victim of that nationalism, but I'll get to that later. So it was obviously that it was hard even to think about civil society, not to mention to act like and participant in civil society. But still, there were few NGOs. Slobodan Milošević was in power, and by any sense, his ruling was authoritarian, and probably it's the euphemism. It's like the best thing you can say about his way of conducting the power. So obviously we have a serious issue with financing. For some reason, to run NGO wasn't illegal, but the state and the government of Serbia and Montenegro of that time did all they could to enable you to do your thing. So I remember that we were forced to go to Budapest, to Soros Fund, to get our funding. Because, as I said, it wasn't illegal, but it wasn't legal either. So the whole thing was very strange, looking at it from today's perspective. First of all, like in any authoritarian state, it was pretty it was hard to imagine that you can be a participant in political life, which is what NGOs should do. So we were forced to mask our acting, and so Plima was registered as the NGO for multicultural and ecology, because Milosevic regime was willing to tolerate that, as long as we are not registered as an NGO who would directly intervene into the political sphere. Of course, we did exactly that, but we were, as I said, masked as the NGO for quoting multicultural and ecology. During the time of, and of course, most of our efforts were in cultural sphere, of course, in ecology sphere, and most of all into multicultural sphere, because we were talking in those war times, we were talking about tolerance, about interethnic and interreligious communication. We were obviously very anti-war, and we were by any means pro-Western, which was exactly the opposite from the mainstream politics in Serbia and Montenegro at that time. By the midst of the next decade, the whole thing just shifted. You know, when we are talking about NGO now, we are basically talking about anti-corruption initiatives. Back in those days, that was even not an issue. It is easy to imagine why. Because, as I said, there was a war. The amount of corruption in the society was unimaginable. Let me say that during that time, when we as Plima Batica were founded, hyperinflation in Serbia and Montenegro reached the highest peak noticed in Europe after after the Germany in 30s. So the whole thing was, as I said, very strange, because our agenda was pretty clear. It was recognized by the, first of all, U.S. Embassy in Montenegro, also the Soros Fund. But we were forced, as I said, to mask our actions into frame which would be considered acceptable by the government. Of course, anyone who dealt with Soros Fund, which was the major financer of the NGO sector in Montenegro and also in Serbia during 90s, faced the accusations of the government was basically telling the public that we were traitors, that we were paid by the so-called international capital involved in some kind of action, which is some kind of a how to put it? you are familiar with conspiracy theories, and you probably laugh at them today. But I gotta tell you that back in 90s in Serbia and Montenegro, conspiracy theories were dominant ideology. Excuse me? Okay. Back in 90s, all kinds of conspiracy theories were basically multiplicated by televisions with national frequency, with all the major newspapers, and were replicated by all the members of the government. So it is fair to say that ideology of Milosevic Yugoslavia was it was basically a conspiracy theory went really bad because it was more dangerous than today, because those conspiracy theories left lots of dead people in Bosnia, Croatia, and later in Kosovo. When we are talking about a really dangerous ideology today, it seems like a joke compared to what we had to face back in those days. Of course, by saying that, I just scratch the very important thing of today, of our situation today. As we are witnessing, even in Europe, and especially in the Eastern Europe, not to mention Russia, echoes of that ideology that we faced in Serbia and Montenegro in the 90s are very strong, even dominant in lots of European countries. The rise of the far right means just that. They are fueled by conspiracy theories, and even the strongest democracy in the world, and by that I mean the United States of America, had a serious problem with conspiracy theories, with ignorance towards civil society, with ignorance towards democracy, and some kind of skepticism against democracy, which also by definition means skepticism, or more than skepticism, against a civil society, was dominant ideology for at least 4 years, even in the United States of America. What should we do now? First of all, I believe we, as the journalists, as the public intellectuals, as the civil society activists, should stick strongly to our beliefs. Our beliefs are right, and no matter what happened, we should fight for our beliefs. The whole thing that's going on right now in Europe, especially in Ukraine, where Russia brutally, barbarically invaded an independent state with obvious plan to put Ukraine back to the Stone Age before they remove their troops. The whole thing that takes place in Balkans, where Serbian nationalism is still threatening, it threatens Kosovo, it threatens Montenegro, it threatens Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in some way it even threatens Croatia, which is part of the European Union. That means that so-called ghosts of the past are still active. They are alive and kicking. And that means, as I see it, that we, as the NGO civil society activists and public intellectuals, we haven't do our job, because our job was to defeat that kind of nationalism, that kind of imperial politics, exactly the same politics that Russia and Serbia are applying right now. They're applying it still. If we did our job, they wouldn't be able to do that. But we failed. We obviously failed. I'm sorry to say that. Maybe we are not the only one to blame, but I insist that we have to take some kind of responsibility for that. I was really sad. You know, I'm approaching my 50 birthday, and I gave at least 2 decades, or let's say 2.5 decades of my life in really an open fight for democracy, and the fight against nationalism, and the fight for Western values, and the fight for Western Balkan region as the part of the European Union. And I can't help but realize that it was pretty much all in vain. I have to admit that I failed. Kosovo, Bosnia, Montenegro, the whole region, we are obviously not a part of the European Union as I dreamed that we would be. We are not stable democracies. We have a lot of things to do in order to become really an open and democratic societies. And after all, nationalisms, especially Serbian nationalism, as the single one most dangerous nationalism in Balkans, is still very alive and is still very active. But we have no other option than to continue our struggle. We have no other option than to act as one, act according to our values, act according to our beliefs. Our goal is just. There is no alternative to the there is no, actually, basically, there is no other good future for this region as than to become part of the European Union. And that's not the most important thing. I really believe that more important than that is to westernize our countries, to accept truly Western and democratic values, and after that, the membership in the European Union will just come as the result of it. And that's the way I prefer it to be. It's, I believe, quite better than to become a part of the European Union as the part of some kind of political compromise, and then to suffer from the diseases of not really consolidated democracies. So anyway, we will talk, I believe, later. You will have the opportunity to ask me questions. I will be more than glad to try to answer. But I would like to underline that simple thing, that we are on the right path. We, as the civil society activists and public intellectuals who really believes in democracy, and even when it seems that European Union, or at least some part of the European Union, are turning their back to democratic values, we are the one who should be really faithful to them, because sometimes people on the periphery, and that would be us, are better in understanding of the importance of democracy and values of freedom.
So, thank you very much, dear Andrej.
Okay, I'm here.
Allow me to highlight a couple of things. First of all, in your interesting presentation, relating the whole story with the conspirative theories, which is something very important nowadays, unfortunately, and also putting this situation in a wider panorama of the international context. Now I will leave the floor to the other panelist, Agon Maliqi, whom you know, those who followed the previous discussions, and the preview panel session. And then after him, after his presentation, we will have a discussion together. So, Agon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bashkim, and thank you, Andrej, for your introductory presentation. I will speak mostly. Okay, I come from civil society myself, although in some way we are all civil society as individuals in whatever we do outside of the domain of the state. I was involved in civil society organizations in a structured way as a co-founder of Zvunker, which is a think tank, blog, kind of a center-left, more of an intellectual platform. But I'm, as I said, I've been involved, especially on issues of democracy, human rights, and transitional justice, as well as regional reconciliation and efforts, especially within Kosovo and Serbia, as an individual in my capacity. So, and then I also work as an analyst considerably these days on issues of democracy and security in the Western Balkans. So I will try to kind of talk both from my personal experience and my research kind of findings on the role of civil society, the history of it, and just kind of highlight some only a few key points and how civil society's role has changed in the Balkans. Obviously, we came in, the very notion of civil society is still relatively new to the Balkans and to Eastern Europe in general. It's, that space, coming out of communism, the first effective civil society groups, organizations were the ones that were organizing the resistance. For example, in Eastern Europe, the unions like Solidarność, these were the first kind of organized civic groups contesting regime authoritarianism. In some countries, the authoritarian regimes fell later, like Andrej mentioned, Serbia, former Yugoslavia, went all the way through the 90s. So civil society took a leading role in the resistance. In the case of Kosovo, Kosovo is a bit more specific because in the 90s, Kosovo has a different civil society legacy because in a way, the entire state, the entire society was civil society. The parallel state was, of Kosovo's parallel state in the 90s was a collective civil society effort. And civil society engaged not just in advocacy against the regime, but also kind of organized society, delivering services, health, education. So it was a much more, in some ways, it also explains the livelihood of civil society in Kosovo today, because we are used to this informality and this engagement outside of the state, sometimes so much that that kind of makes that causes some damage in some cases because it keeps the state weak because we are used to operating at non-state levels. And then when when Kosovo was liberated or when the authoritarian regimes fell throughout the Balkans, civil society took on this role of sort of the agent of the transition, sort of helping states reform, transition into liberal democracies. And in doing so, it kind of became more of it detached a little bit from that grassroots and civic, wider mobilization, and became more of a top-down, mostly Western-funded entity in society that had more of its advocacy function. And these are the laws that we need to implement to get into Europe. So it became more of a round table and capacity building kind of entity, trying to get the countries into the European Union and NATO, and then it kind of lost this constituency base a little bit. And this has been the general role of civil society for the past couple of decades, I would say. And since we're kind of still stuck in that transition, in what I have called in my writing this illiberal equilibrium, where we can't seem to, we have these various versions of democracy, mostly hybrid regimes, electoral democracies, but still, weak in terms of rule of law and things like that. So we still cannot, none of the countries can qualify as a liberal democracy, and some have even backslided a lot, like particularly Serbia. Civil society has also kind of operated, its role has also been damaged in this democratic backsliding. And I would highlight 4 key reasons why. First is, this external drive was lost, with the weakening of the EU accession perspective for all of the countries. Civil society stopped playing that function effectively because, there is no tangible EU path, at least for now. So it could not play that role of, making reforms, because those reforms are effective, and producing papers and laws and legislation, because those kind of reforms just became a smokescreen for legitimizing authoritarian regime. So the weakening of the European accession perspective also weakened the role of civil society in holding states accountable. The second is, in general, the economies of the Balkans continue to be very kleptocratic, clientelistic, and society, including a lot of middle classes, who are usually the ones who have more demands and want to hold governments accountable, are considerably prioritizing economic security or ethnic security over human rights and democracy concerns. So many people will, a considerable majority will be fine with corruption, with nationalist governments, as long as they provide some basic economic security or protect the nation from threats. The authoritarian leaders usually create these sort of threats and present themselves as protectors. And so a lot of people are prioritizing these security, both their personal, economic, and and then they're willing to overlook, including civil society, these human rights violations. This is true in pretty much most of the countries in the Balkans. The third element I would highlight is that in this context, the political elites have managed to treat and continue to delegitimize civil society as sort of a foreign agent, and then civil society has kind of given them the space, I think, to do this, because, as I mentioned earlier, most of it has kind of lost touch a little bit with the base and discusses the things that are kind of more abstract for grassroots communities. But so it's being targeted, especially by political elites and by business interests, who still view, regardless of the fact that civil society has been weakened, they still view it as a kind of a threat, because civil society continues to kind of disrupt illiberal governments. For example, in Serbia, investigative journalists who are doing some brave work with highlighting corruption of the regime there, they still manage to disrupt the agenda, disrupt the conversation from what the political elites and the business elites want the agenda to be. And the last point I would highlight of this weakness is this issue of continued low sustainability. It's still very dependent on foreign funding because it's not constituency based. There's no community. There's very weak community base. In the Western Balkans in general, there is a culture of giving, but that culture of giving, is mostly for humanitarian causes. People will give or donate to humanitarian and charity causes, but not as much for organizations or for human rights groups. And there's still that kind of mistrust in these or even lack of interest on these more abstract issues. And human rights groups have been unable to overcome that barrier and sort of create more organic and grassroots ties. But not all is, I would say, gloomy. We have seen over the past decade or more the emergence of a new generation of civil society, which is more grassroots, which is less structured. We have new forms of organization that are a bit more sporadic, especially issue-based, particularly, for example, on themes like gender rights, environment. These have been able to mobilize people, get them on the streets. They usually, especially, have this social media dimension to it. There's new forms of networking, more fluid ones. But then these have also shown some signs of weaknesses. Again, the issue of sustainability. Again, this is still one on and off engagement. They rely a lot on not structured organizations, but individuals who are working in certain areas professionally, but then have to dedicate a certain amount of their time for these causes. Sometimes they can, sometimes they not. So these movements phase in, phase out. They have a challenge also of securing funding, especially from foreign donors, because they have usually they're not really organized in the kind of way donors want them to, and they don't have the kind of standard procedures that are needed, don't know how to write these grants that are usually very complicated. But now also some donors are trying to understand this, and they're changing their funding mechanisms, and they're supporting more of these individual grassroots initiatives. Because they are seeing their potential, but still, these are still very vulnerable groups. Some other vulnerabilities have emerged with the new civil society ecosystem, and it's not only pro-democracy forces that are present in the new ecosystem. Foreign actors, malign actors, particularly Russian-funded or other extremist groups, they are also creating their civil society networks and sort of using them for another kind of agenda, which is not in the direction of human rights and democracy. And then there is also the emergence of what is known as the NGOs, which are civil society groups or organizations that are created by authoritarian regimes to play the role of civil society, but ineffectively are co-opted and part of the government's agenda. So it's government NGOs, NGOs. They usually try to stimulate civil society and sort of create parallel voices and just confuse the public discourse. And we're seeing also increasing growth in their numbers. But then again, as I said, not always gloomy. We are seeing with, for example, mobilization, as I said, on women's rights, massive protests, also on environmental issues. We are seeing mobilization. So these issue-based movements are emerging. We are also seeing a new wave, because the political parties are usually problematic and there is limited space for change to come in the system through political parties. Sometimes we are also seeing these groups, issue-based groups, mobilizing in politically. and becoming also turning into political options. We've seen that in Croatia, especially, for example, where the a movement like Možemo was able to take local power in Zagreb. And we've seen some of that also emerge in Serbia with these environmental groups creating a much smaller, but still kind of trying to create a similar model of a civic group based, created by civil society, but then turned into a political option. So it's still, the situation is still kind of evolving. There is now this, coexistence between the old and the new civil society, the old being this more think tankish, foreign funded, a bit more detached civil society that is detached from the grassroots, and the new grassroots that is less foreign funded, more organic, but less sustainable and less well connected and networked internationally, especially. And sometimes there is also this antagonism between these two different civil society types. And but let's see where this goes. I just want to kind of throw some of this bit of a historical perspective and this develop this typology of groups and challenges to kind of lead maybe the discussion and sort of maybe direct some provoke some questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Agon, for this complex view that you gave us of the situation of civil society nowadays. And there is a question from the public. I think someone, I guessed from the kind of question that it is a civil society activist. The question came by writing, but you can also ask questions by speaking. However, because this question, the first one, is addressed to Agon. What are some, what are some of the democratic institutions where civil society can be supported?
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. What is understood here by institutions? So if the person who posed this question could just maybe just clarify so that I don't go in some sort of direction that the question does not intend. Is the question more like what are the forms through which civil society can be supported?
Some of the institutions, what kind of institutions? That's how I understand it, at least, or the person should clarify it.
Yeah. If the question is, support for civil society has mostly, as I said, financial, most has come from abroad. There have been, various either private foundations, philanthropists. Andrej mentioned the Soros being one of the biggest ones, Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Then there are sort of state-supported ones like National Endowment for Democracy. There's huge, what is called democracy assistance framework internationally that supports civil society. At the EU level, as I said, support for civil society has also been very, very, okay, and now I understand, at the EU level, the EU has also created a lot of mechanisms as part of the accession process, where civil society can play a role in supporting the kind of reforms that are needed to join the EU. And then there are other, for example, the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, which are funding mechanisms not directly tied to accession, but for which Western Balkan NGOs are eligible, and where especially democracy and human rights issues are supported. And then there are bilateral donors, from countries, EU member states, and in the Balkans, quite a lot of them are active in various areas, from security and human rights topics. The Netherlands, for example, or Germany. Although Germany's assistance is more focused on technical development assistance, democracy support does not feature that much. That is kind of mostly coming from EU funding. But still, bilaterally, a lot of these countries have their funding mechanisms, their instruments either within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or development agencies that they have. There's a wide spectrum of organizations supporting democracy work. There are then mechanisms created within the states, so countries themselves creating agencies, such as the one that Bashki mentioned, which is providing support for this initiative in Albania, through which some support is channeled, by countries themselves. But I do think that increasingly what is becoming more important, especially for this new wave of civil society groups, I forgot to mention in Europe a very important funder, which has in a couple of last years become more relevant, is the European Endowment for Democracy, which is funded by the EU. It's somewhat of an equivalent of the US's National Endowment for Democracy, so it's a democracy support fund. And they have more flexible funding arrangements in that they usually support startup initiatives, informal groups, even individuals who are doing something new. So if you're into that kind of thing, the European Endowment for Democracy could be an interesting address. But I'll go back to this need for the new grassroots community, crowdfunding and trying to build a community, because ultimately that has become the most sustainable form. I did mention in my previous discussion that sometimes that is very difficult, because it's really difficult to get a critical mass of people who not just care enough for these topics, but care so much that they are willing to give. But ultimately, at least one share of that support for civil society, needs to come, and groups who really want to ensure sustainability need to try to focus on building a community and building a group of supporters, and try to fundraise domestically from people with who have a genuine interest in particular areas. So, in very sort of bullet point terms, these are the kind of various mechanisms. So US, EU level, bilateral European countries have their funding mechanisms. Countries themselves in the Balkans have their funding mechanisms. And then there are, various philanthropists, who have a particular focus on the Balkans. And then, of course, these self-reliant, self-funding mechanisms, the crowdfunding. That should be the future of civil society sustainability. So I hope that kind of at least answered your question a little bit.
Thank you, Agon. Now, other questions from the people who are following us, from the public? You can either write or speak. Anyway, I have a question. I have several questions, but first I will start with, I will ask a question to Andrej, although I will expect and wish to have questions not only from me, but from the public. My question to Andrej is about the Orthodox Church in Montenegro, its role, because as it was said here, civil society organizations are not only having positive roles, they are also sometimes related with power or with with negative phenomenon, with anti-freedom phenomenon in the society. So, or with conservative attitudes. So, as far as I know, there's been a strong role of the Orthodox Church in Montenegro. What is your comment on this? What do you have to say about this, if you consider interesting discussing, Andrej?
First of all, let me make a reference to the previous question. This is how it is in Montenegro. So there are governmental funds for funding the NGOs. We are talking about very small amount of money, but obviously the idea that government is funding non-governmental organization is, especially in Balkans, it comes with some controversy, because you know how our politicians are when they are giving you money, which is, of course, not their own money, but the money of the citizens of Montenegro. They are expecting to get something in back, and they are expecting NGOs to close their eyes and not to talk about what NGOs should talk. Also, every single local community have funds for NGOs. Of course, we are also talking about really small amounts of money, but in a way, let's say that in Montenegro, even the state, the government, and the local communities are into funding NGOs. So, in a way, one could say that state of Montenegro recognizes the importance of NGOs. I would always prefer to get money from abroad in order to stay away from the toxic influence of the government, no matter are we talking about a state government or the local government. The role of the, now back to your question, the role of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Montenegro is crucial, basically, in this society, because we 2 years ago we were witnessing the process in which Serbian Orthodox Church basically overthrown the government of Montenegro and introduces their own government. After the elections in August 2020, the government was, and I'm not joking, formed in the monastery of Ostrog, which is an Orthodox monastery near Nikšić, which is a city in Montenegro. So the Metropolitan of the Serbian Orthodox Church, Amfilohije, called the politicians into monastery, and he formed the government. So that was the end of democracy in Montenegro. That was the end of divide between state and the church, etc., etc. After that, we were witnessing, and prior to that, we were witnessing some very strange synergy between some of the NGOs and the Serbian Orthodox Church, and we were even witnessing unimaginable that some of the NGOs which were supposed to take care of the rights of the LGBTIQ population were basically pinkwashing the actions of the Serbian Orthodox Church. And if there is any need to say that church is very homophobic, as lots of the as most of the Orthodox churches are. After those elections 2 years ago, the role of the, prior to that, very vibrant civil society was somehow changed. It seems to me that lots of the NGO activists who were very outspoken critiques of former government became very quiet, surprisingly quiet, and very careful when it comes to the critique of the new government. In the last couple of months, it somehow, in some way, changes. Some of those people who were really active in correcting the former government realized that they should really do their job. And now we are witnessing that some kind of resurgence of NGO. I mean, at some point, I have to say, NGO was a really important political factor in Montenegro. They were not a joke by any means. I mean, after all, NGOs were very important part of overthrowing the Milo Đukanović government. What I expect now from them is to do exactly the same, to overthrow this government, because this government is obviously, by any means, more dangerous, more or less democratic, and more toxic and more open to, first of all, Serbian, then to Russian influence than Đukanović government was.
So do you think that the funding of the NGOs, of the civil society by the governments is more harmful, is rather harmful in the countries where there is no tradition, no democratic tradition, in which there is no consolidated democracy, like in the Western Balkans, and not so much harmful in developed democracies?
Yeah, that's exactly what I think. But also, I think we should take their money because it's not their money, as I already said. It's citizens' money. But we should be very careful not to act as we owe them something.
I see. I see. Any other question from the public? More questions, please. Anyway, then let me ask a question to Agon. Some years ago, not a few years, but let's say 10 years ago or more, let's say almost 20 years, if I'm not wrong, there was a strong, a powerful civil society movement, social movement, let's say, in Kosovo, Vetëvendosja, self-determination. Then it turned into a political party, although sometimes before having before winning the elections and becoming a governmental party, they behaved sometimes still like an NGO or like a civil society association. So now that although this unclear attitude, I don't think is good for democracy. I don't know, what do you think? But on the other hand, after the Vetëvendosja has become part of the government, is it created a void somehow by the place it has left in the civil society in Kosovo?
My short answer would be not necessarily, but we have to understand what type of group Vetëvendosja was, even as what type of civil society group it was. So it started as a kind of a anti-system movement, not necessarily, not necessarily a reformist or a liberal democracy kind of group. It started off as an anti-colonial, against UNMIK, the UN rule, and then with independence against the elite, against sort of an anti-establishment more than a kind of movement, with a more clear, as I said, agenda focusing on, national themes and national liberation kind of themes. And then it kind of, they saw themselves as a movement, as activists, but then they decided to split the roles when they entered formal politics. So continue to be activists on the street, but also play a role in politics in the parliament, and then in local government. They wanted to win a couple of municipalities. So they became more political and put the activism maybe equal footing, but not as important as in the past. And now they are fully sort of political. They are the establishment, the new establishment. The gap that they created is, I wouldn't call it a gap, because in a way, they did manage to, they succeeded in one thing, in disrupting a certain type of government in Kosovo. But they were never necessarily or fully a pro-liberal democracy group. I myself have a little bit of suspicions also on that. We still are uncertain how they will behave in government, whether they will resort back to certain, authoritarian tendencies. Now that we've gotten rid of the old elite, are we going towards a new form of capture, or are they going to continue with an agenda that is, for rule of law and for So in that sense, civil society in Kosovo is still strong enough, I think, even without them, and has shown that it is willing to hold Vedendosje accountable as well. And you see that in Kosovo, society is quite vibrant. Vedendosje won with 51% in one election, and then kind of lost a year later in local elections. Situation is much more fluid. People have high expectations, and I do think that civil society is playing a role in creating that climate of accountability. So I wouldn't say it left a huge gap. What I do think it might be leaving a gap in is that this is what usually happens in the Balkans when more left-leaning groups go into power, is that they remove a lot of capacity from NGOs, human capacity. Everybody then kind of enters politics and government, and then NGOs, which are in many cases very dependent on these individuals, or then they kind of then they become a bit more weaker. Yeah.
Thank you, Agon. Now there is a question from Sofiana. How can a civil society contribute to the development of democracy when it does not act on its own, but is influenced by political parties? Sofiana, to whom is addressed this question? To both, or to one of them in special?
So if I can say,
Please.
It's the most important. It turned out, at least in Montenegro, that it's the most important question, because the NGO, which becomes part of the extension of the political party, no matter if we are talking about position or opposition, is no longer an NGO. It's just, as I said, extension of the political party. So it is a very dangerous thing for any of the NGOs in terms of integrity and reputation. And once when you agree to act in some kind of synchronicity with the political parties, and it's usually with opposition, that's the moment when you are losing a large part of your integrity. Okay, I understand that sometimes, especially in situations when you have an authoritarian structure in power, NGO has to do so, but it is exactly what NGO should avoid to do, because there is a high price to pay, you know, because there is a good probability that you will burn your own integrity and you won't be able to do your thing anymore after that open cooperation with political parties. I would say that ideal position for the NGO is independent one. Basically, to act like an opposition, both to the position and the opposition parties.
Yeah, if I can just add in that direction, I think the key thing here is consistency on the issues, because NGOs usually have a particular mission or a goal that they want to achieve. And and in a lot of cases, that mission can align with government or opposition. I don't think people in society should shy away or be afraid of being perceived necessarily as being part of one camp or the other, as long as that argument fits the mission. But that's a very tricky and delicate thing to do, because it's usually usually politicians try to instrumentalize civil society groups, and then, as Andrej mentioned, to delegitimize them, to turn them into figures, and to put them into camps, so that you say this NGO is part of that political group, so of course they're saying this. I think this kind of reputation is built with consistency and through time. And through commitment, and not fearing to be perceived in a certain way as supporting someone or something, for as long as people will see the consistency and that you are consistent on the values and not on the particular parties, then that makes sense. And I just like to add one thing, it's sometimes, it's normal to have alignment sometimes between political parties. And in the Western world, for example, NGOs, as I said, are mission-driven and ideological. The civil rights movement in the US, or like I don't know, various groups working for example, African American enfranchisement, they usually coalesce or support, for example, Democratic Party candidates, because their issue is, they are civil society, but their issues are more represented by that political party, and that's completely normal, and until that, and if that party then starts to not follow that mission, then they can hold that party accountable. So it's normal that even for think tanks, for who have certain ideology or worldview, to be seen as being closer to a certain group, but you preserve that that integrity, and when you criticize that party if they are not following those, so it's all about consistency in the messaging, and and not being afraid of being stigmatized or being put into a camp, a certain political camp.
Yeah, I agree. I agree definitely. But what happened in Montenegro? NGOs were very, very active in process of detronizing Đukanović and his government, and the key moment was the one I already mentioned, when Serbian Orthodox Church Metropolitan Philohije made the government of Montenegro in monastery Ostrog. NGOs stayed quiet. That was the death of those NGOs. They simply, that's unimaginable. What kind of NGO you are if it's okay with you that church is forming government? That's the key question. They stayed quiet and they paid the price. For next year and a half, they acted like the puppets of the new government. But of course, what's our situation? We don't have the other NGO sector. We have to do. We have to play with them. We have to help them to regain the integrity which they voluntarily gave away. Okay, we have to be patient, and we have to rebuild the trust of the public to the NGOs.
Thank you, Agon and Andrej. Now there is a question from Erika for both of you. Which do you think is the best strategy in which civil society, NGOs, can influence the governments in our region to accept lasting change in social/economic reforms? So this is for both of you.
Shall I? Yeah. Okay. I'll begin. This is a broad question, but a very interesting one. This is a common dilemma always on how to do this. There are two approaches, and I think one should always know what politicians think of when they set their agenda. They care about public perceptions and follow issues when they become public and important to the public. They respond to these kind of incentives. So sometimes things can be achieved, with a constructive approach. If you just lobby parties, politicians, if something is being drafted, discussed, in a lot of contexts, you can do the change by just, working with the government constructively. The civil society does not necessarily have to be antagonistic. And if it's an opposition party, you work with the opposition party in throwing in legislation or things that you think are important for the cause. So it's not necessarily antagonistic. You can work also within the system or with people within the system who you can identify as potential allies. And in my experience, you'd be surprised that sometimes, it's actually very easy because, in the government, sometimes they don't even have ideas. They don't know what they're doing. So they are very welcome and open to people who come with specific or concrete ideas. But in most cases, actually, the antagonistic approach then also helps, to make the issue visible, to put public pressure. In Albania, the student protests, for example, a couple of years ago, they did manage to, they put the government in considerable pressure. And, now you suddenly have new dorms, new this, new that, so the moment politicians feel pressure, and I think civil society in that sense should view itself also as political. Sometimes this word political is stigmatized as, being part of political parties, government. No, everybody is political and every cause is political. So to push for that cause, you can either choose the constructive approach, or if that doesn't work, the antagonistic approach, which is make the issue visible, make it important for the public, make it attractive, and so that politicians pay attention to it. And then, if necessary, go to the streets. We're seeing now in Kosovo, for example, on gender rights. I think it's having a tremendous impact. How domestic violence has become a national issue from activists, and now all of a sudden, media are reporting constantly about it. Activists are putting pressure on prosecutors and judges, and now prosecutors and judges are being suspended because they're giving lenient sentences to abusers. And every new prosecutor and new judge who is now dealing with cases of domestic violence is maybe thinking once or twice, that his case might become a scandal someday in the media, and he will remember the previous judges and prosecutors who were suspended or fired because of protests. And that, I think, is a systemic change. That's how you kind of create it, through pressure, by making the issues visible, by shaming officials. So, both approaches, I think, work.
Yeah, I'd agree with Agon on this and all the other issues, obviously. But you know, there is I would just like to add, there is an interesting thing, you know, happening, at least in Montenegro in the last couple of years. There are lots of NGOs who are formed in last 2 years, whose values are completely different from the values of the, I'd say, traditional civil society. Lots of NGOs that don't really believe in not even in civil society, but also not in democracy. They are not really believe in European integration of the region. I'm obviously talking about right-wing NGOs, and that's a completely new phenomena in Montenegro, because obviously it's not a new thing in Europe or the United States, but as I said, it is a new thing in Montenegro. Those NGOs are heavily connected to Serbian Orthodox Church. Lots of them are more conservative in a very wrong way, because I don't have an issue with a traditional, let's say, Churchillian conservatism. But you know, so there is a completely new landscape of NGOs in Montenegro. And when we were talking about NGOs, we used to talk about organizations who are committed to liberal democracy, human rights, and all the other values which we usually connect with the civil society. Those new NGOs, which are obviously also a part of the civil society, are completely opposite to that. And we'll see how this newly formed dynamic works.
Thank you, Agon and Andrej. Let me add something about what Andrej just said about, let's say, reactionary or regressive NGOs. Well, in former Yugoslavia, the process of nationalism and all that, it has at its very root, or its very embryo, let's say, the Writers' Union, which was an NGO within the communist system and part of the structure. But it can be considered, because it was an organization, it was not the government itself. It has a certain independence, and it won more after the fall of communism. Anyway, to Agon, I would just make a comment to what he said. The students' movement in Albania at the end of, it was 4 years ago, 2018. It was really a powerful movement. Although it was not an organization, a civil society organization, it was a spontaneous movement of the civil society. But maybe, I think, because they didn't want to have a leadership, they didn't want to have spokesmen or spokeswomen, representatives, at a certain moment it disintegrated. Although it was an earthquake and half of the government fell. But maybe this lack of articulation, of organization, of representation, this absolutely horizontal configuration they had, maybe this was the problem for them, that at a certain moment it fizzled down. What do you think?
Yeah, I mentioned this in my preliminary discussion and talk, that the new movements have this challenge. You can see that there is a grievance, that there is it was visible on the street that there were legitimate concerns, although there was talk that there's some political motivation behind it, but still you cannot delegitimize it. It was clearly organic and grassroots. And then it was clearly managed to create an agenda, and for at least several weeks, managed to put the government in serious pressure. but this is the problem of the new civil society, which is the sporadic, less structured, is that it dissipates very easily, and then the challenge is to, because ultimately you need some kind of structure, you need organization, you need the people who are sitting at an office and doing the kind of things that that are maybe even boring, or or in some cases, and that's why I mentioned Croatia, these then evolve. If the political spectrum does not respond, if there is no space in the political parties for any kind of change, then they turn into actual political options. So the new civil society has to kind of learn how to do both, either of these things in various contexts. Either become more structured and consistent. I've never seen any follow-up of the student movement in Albania, or like, did the government actually implement everything that they committed after the protests? Nobody was really, from that group, maybe systematically following that up as an organization or as a group, or they become political options. And then the challenge here on this case is how to, because usually these movements are very narrow issue based. It's a student movement about student issues, environmentalists about local water pollution, or local hydro plants, or gender rights. These are all usually fall in the spectrum of the left, green left kind of, and then in Croatia they managed to kind of get these various groups into and to create a common agenda, because these issues are still kind of related. They have a common theme and a common cause of the problem, which is usually irresponsive government, authoritarian government. So yeah, this is kind of the challenge now, is how to get both more organized or even more political.
Thank you, Agon. Other questions? Okay, then, because the end of the session is coming, it's quite near. We have only a few minutes. Sorry, I have only one question, the last one. This is for Andrej. Of course, if someone will have any other question, perhaps we can do, but you said we failed. I mean, civil society activists fighting for freedom, for democracy, for human rights. We failed. Why do you say we failed? When you were in front of such a big structure of power. Could we say, for instance, that those who were in a even more difficult situation, the dissidents in the former Soviet bloc, that they didn't, for instance, on Soviet Union or Romania, or that they didn't overthrow the regime? Could you say that they failed? Is it not that they somehow left the seed for the future? And I think this is my opinion. What you did also is something that is not, the battle is not ended. What do you think of this?
There is a thing. I personally aimed for something better than this. Of course, obviously, in the region, things are better than they were, let's say, 20 or 25 or 30 years ago. But also, the whole region has lots of issues. The whole thing, first of all, nationalistic narrative was not terminated. And that's where I think we really failed. Nationalist narrative is very strong and therefore very dangerous, because you never know where can it lead the society. Ethnical distance between kids in the schools in Montenegro is enormous. We simply haven't do much to narrow the ethnic distance, let's say, between Serbs and Albanians in Montenegro. Also, ethnic distance between Montenegrins and Serbs became out of proportion in the meantime. New kind of divides emerged in the meantime. Also, as I said, we haven't become part, and by we, I mean the region, we haven't become part of the European Union. I don't really believe that we are closer to that goal than we were 5 years ago, let's say. And that's why I'm not completely satisfied. Of course, all of us who were acting as the public intellectuals, let's say, made an enormous effort. We really tried hard, but sometimes trying hard is not enough. Maybe the goal was set too high. Maybe even the better than us wouldn't achieve and would fail. But I really think that it's healthier to stay in the realm of self-criticism than to try to invent some kind of excuses, first of all for myself, and after that for all the other actors in the public sphere. I really believe that criticism, and especially self-criticism, is the healthiest way to deal with things. But I mean, of course, as long as I live, I will fight for my goals, and with some luck, some of those goals would be achieved. But for now, they simply did not.
There is another question here. Don't you think you're being too hard on the progress you've made so far? Self-criticism may be good, but wouldn't it be better to look at it with an optimistic view? I suppose this is for Andrej. But anyway, both can answer if Agon feels to.
I believe I explained the roots of my self-criticism, you know. Of course, you have to be, you have to preserve some kind of optimism in order to have the energy and will to fight, of course. And ultimately, I believe my goals would be achieved, because I think my thing is just, you know, but I don't think it would help to cheer myself and the others when it's obvious that Montenegro in the last 2 years made a large leap backwards, you know. In order to fix it, first things to do is to make a proper diagnosis, you know, and that's basically my position. I mean, of course, lots of people from the civil society would tell you different. They would probably be more optimistic. But do you know that I can't help but to quote this one? Do you know that Lacan once said that hope in better tomorrow leads to suicide?
I didn't, how it was, I didn't get it.
So basically, optimism leads to suicide. You know
Okay, we should finish now. I'm told by the webmaster. So thank you very much, Andrej. Thank you very much, Agon, and all the young people that followed us the session, for the question and for their attention. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.